Ever found yourself maybe wondering about the rights of temporary agency workers? I'm talking about the EU specifically. It's a massive part of the workforce there. But things can get, well, let's just say complicated with all the different countries, different rules. It can feel a bit like navigating a maze, you know?
It can be a real headache.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole world of temporary agency work in the EU.
Hmm.
Specifically, we're looking at this thing called Directive 2008-104-EC.
Yeah, that directive's a big deal. Before it came along, the situation for these temporary agency workers across the EU, well, it was kind of all over the place.
Really? Like how so?
Imagine a patchwork quilt, right? Where every single patch has its own different rules. It was a bit like that.
Okay, I think I get you. So, like, if you were a temporary worker and you moved from, say, Italy to Sweden for a job, things could get messy.
Exactly. Confusing, potentially unfair even. One country might have all these strong worker protections while another might have barely any. Not exactly a level playing field, you know?
And that's where this Directive 2008-104-EC swoops in.
You got it. Think of it like trying to create a common set of rules for this type of work across the entire EU.
Ah, so it's like setting a baseline, making sure that no matter where you're working within the EU, you've got at least these fundamental rights as a temporary worker.
Exactly. And it's not just about a baseline either. It's also about, raising the overall quality of temporary agency work as a whole. The directive, it's trying to make sure that being a temporary worker isn't like a loophole for fewer rights, fewer protections. It's about ensuring everyone's treated fairly, temporary or not.
Right, that makes sense. So how does it actually work in practice? What are the big things this directive's aiming to achieve?
Well, it boils down to two main goals. The first one, protecting temporary agency workers,
Yeah.
making absolutely sure they're not treated worse than permanent employees just because they're working through an agency.
Okay, so no more like getting paid less for doing the exact same job just because you're on a temporary contract.
You hit the nail on the head. That's a big part of it. This directive, it lays the groundwork for equal treatment, and this equal treatment thing, it's basically a core principle that you find all throughout EU law.
So I'm guessing goal number two has to be about making temporary agency work itself more, well, appealing.
You got it. The directive's trying to make this whole temporary work thing more secure, more attractive, both for the people doing the work and the companies hiring them. It's about encouraging its use, but preventing anyone from being exploited in the process.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
So how does the directive actually, put all that into action? Where do we even start?
Well, a good chunk of the directive, it's all about this thing called equal treatment. That's where the rubber really meets the road, for temporary workers. And it's all laid out in Article 5, which you could think of as like the heart and soul of this whole piece of legislation.
So Article 5 is saying treat temporary workers the same as permanent employees, basically. But what does that look like in reality? How does that actually work?
So, what they're trying to do is make sure that, at least for the time that a temporary agency worker is on assignment, they get the same basic working conditions as someone who's employed directly by the company.
So we're talking the nitty-gritty stuff here. Hours, overtime pay, breaks, holiday time, all of that's covered.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about vague implications here. The directive gets into the specifics: duration of working time, overtime, breaks, rest periods, night work, holidays, even public holidays. It's all covered.
Wow, they really went all out in Article 5, huh? Didn't leave much wiggle room there.
Nope, not at all. And that focus on being crystal clear, it's so important because let's be real, employment contracts, they can get pretty tricky.
Oh, tell me about it.
There are always these little nuances, different ways of setting things up. And that's where things get kind of interesting, legally speaking, at least.
Okay, you've got to give me an example. What kind of nuances are we talking about?
Okay, let's talk pay. So the directive, it gets that some temporary workers, they actually have these permanent contracts with their agencies.
Right, so they're kind of like always on the books, even if they're not actively on an assignment.
Exactly. And those workers, they might still be getting paid between assignments, even if they're not technically working for the company where they were placed last.
Hmm. So in those cases, it wouldn't really make sense to demand equal pay from that specific company, right? Because the worker's not actually like working for them at that moment.
You're getting it, and the directives understands that. It actually allows countries to make an exception to that whole equal pay rule in those very specific situations.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like a blanket rule. There's some flexibility built in.
There is, but here's the catch. They can only make that exception after talking with people representing both the workers and the employers. Think, like, unions and employer organizations.
Ah, so there's a safeguard. It's not just a free pass for companies to pay temporary workers less. They got to justify it.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, right? Flexibility on the one hand, but fairness on the other. It's a theme you see popping up again and again in this directive.
I bet. So this might seem like a weird question, but what about stuff like using the company gym or eating in the canteen or even childcare if the company offers it? Is that covered under equal treatment too?
That's a really good question because you're right. Those perks, those little extras, they can make a huge difference in someone's workday. And the answer is basically yes. The directive addresses that too.
Really? That's cool.
It says that temporary agency workers, they should generally have the same access to those things, facilities, amenities, whatever you want to call them, as the permanent employees do, unless, of course, there's a really good reason why they can't.
So it's about more than just the paycheck and the hours on the timesheet. It's about making those temporary workers feel like they're a real part of the team, even if they're only there for a little while.
You got it. And this whole idea of inclusion, it even extends to things like worker representation, which honestly doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
When we say worker representation, we're talking about things like unions, right? Worker councils, those kinds of groups that have a say in how a company's run, advocate for worker rights, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And Article 7 of the directive, it really digs into how temporary workers fit into that whole picture. It gives countries some options, different ways to count temporary agency workers when they're figuring out who gets to be part of these representative bodies.
Which is a big deal, right? Because depending on the country, these groups, they can have real power. I mean, they can negotiate better working conditions, influence company decisions, even challenge stuff that's unfair.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important that temporary workers are a part of those discussions, that they get a voice at the table, even if their employment situation is, well, temporary.
So what are the options? How does the directive suggest handling this whole representation thing?
So one option is to count the temporary agency workers towards the total number needed to actually form one of these representative bodies. But here's the thing, they'd be doing it within the temporary work agency itself.
Right, so if those workers are employed by the agency, they should get a say in how that agency is run.
Makes sense.
Makes sense to me. But it gets even more interesting with the second option.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
The directive also says, hey, countries can choose to count those temporary workers towards the threshold at the user undertaking too.
Hold on, back up a sec. The user undertaking, that's the company where they're actually doing the work, right? Even though they're not technically employed by them.
You got it. And it's huge because it means that even if they're not on the company's payroll directly, if there are enough temporary workers there, they could still have a real impact on worker representation at that company.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
It really is. It shows how the directive recognizes that temporary workers, especially if they've been at a company for a while, they have a stake in how that company operates.
Yeah.
They deserve a voice there too, maybe even through these representative bodies.
Yeah, it's acknowledging their contribution even if it's not a permanent position. I like it. It's all about fairness, right? And speaking of fairness, that commitment to a level playing field, it's even more obvious when you see how the directive deals with restrictions on temporary agency work.
Okay, so now we're getting into the situations where a country might want to, like, limit or even put the brakes on temporary work altogether. What's the thinking there? What does the directive say about that?
Well, you have to remember there are some legitimate reasons why a country might want to have some control over how temporary agency work is used, right? Maybe they're worried about companies exploiting workers.
Or maybe they're trying to protect certain types of jobs, or they have concerns about how it all impacts the economy.
All of that. It's not about banning temporary work outright. It's about having some ground rules, making sure it's not being abused.
Right, makes sense. So how does the directive handle that?
Well, there's this whole section, Article 4, which basically says that if a country wants to restrict temporary agency work, they can't just do it willy-nilly. They need a really good, solid reason.
So what qualifies as a really good reason in this case? What does the directive actually consider legit?
The big ones are like protecting the temporary workers themselves, first and foremost, right? Making sure nobody's taking advantage of them or using them in a way that undercuts their rights. Then there's making sure health and safety standards are being met, especially in industries that can be dangerous. And then, of course, there's ensuring the labor market as a whole is functioning properly and preventing abuses.
It's like, yeah, temporary work can be a good thing, But there need to be some rules to make sure it doesn't go off the rails.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that any restrictions, they have to be justifiable, proportionate to the goal they're trying to achieve, and they can't be discriminatory at all. It's a balancing act for sure, but the directive gives them a framework to work with.
It sounds like they really thought of everything.
They tried to, and you know what? It really highlights how tricky this whole issue can be.
What do you mean?
This whole balance between flexibility in the labor market, letting businesses adapt and all that, and making sure workers have protections, it's a tough one. Like walking a tightrope sometimes. You can say that again. And it reminds us that these aren't just like abstract ideas we're talking about here, right? They have real consequences for people. That's why the directive goes beyond just setting rules. It actually tries to make sure those rules are being followed.
Okay, so let's talk enforcement then. What happens if a company's just like, nah, we're going to ignore all this directive stuff? Do they just get away with it?
Not if the EU has anything to do with it. The directive's super clear. Countries, they need to put actual penalties in place for companies that break the rules, and not just a slap on the wrist either.
Yeah, it's got to be something that actually makes them think twice, right?
Exactly. Otherwise, what's the point? And it's not enough to just have the penalties. There has to be a way for workers to actually, make use of them. The directive says there need to be clear procedures in place, whether it's through the courts or some other system, so workers and their representatives can actually take action if their rights are violated.
Because having rights written down somewhere is one thing, but if there's no way to actually enforce them, what's the point, right?
Yeah.
They're just words on a page.
Totally. And you know what else? Remember how we were talking about countries needing a really good reason to restrict agency work? Well, the directive makes them report back to the European Commission about what they find.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they can't just make a decision and walk away. They have to explain their reasoning, show their work, basically.
Exactly. It's all about transparency and accountability, making sure countries are actually following through on what they signed up for.
It's kind of amazing how much detail they put into this directive. They really did think of everything.
It's impressive, right? It wasn't just about like throwing some rules on paper and hoping for the best. They really tried to think it through, balance the needs of everyone involved, and make sure those worker rights actually mean something.
They really did. So we've talked about the past, we've talked about the present. What about the future? Any thoughts on where all this is headed?
That's a great question. Because the world of work, it's not exactly standing still, is it? Think about the gig economy. All those apps connecting freelancers with work, people driving for ride-sharing companies. None of that really existed back in 2008 when this directive was first put into place.
That's true. Things are changing so fast. It's a whole new world out there.
Right, and that's what makes it so interesting. We have this directive, which was incredibly forward-thinking for its time. But now we have to ask ourselves, how do these rules, these protections we've been talking about, how do they apply to these new ways of working?
It's like, how do we make sure everyone benefits from these changes, not just a select few? Those are some big questions.
They are big questions, and unfortunately, we don't have all the answers. Not yet, anyway. But the good news is, people are thinking about them, talking about them, and that's where it all starts.
That's a good point. So to wrap things up, we've gone deep on Directive 2008-104-EC, dug into the rights it gives temporary agency workers, and even peeked into the future a little.
It's been a great deep dive, I think. We covered a lot of ground.
We did. And to everyone listening, if any of this resonated with you, if you're curious about your own rights as a worker, or if you just found this whole discussion fascinating,
Don't stop here. Keep that curiosity going. The world of work can be complicated, but the more you understand how it all works, the better off you'll be.
knowledge is power. That's what we always say.
Absolutely. Until next time.
It's like trying to hit a moving target, right? The world keeps changing.
Exactly. And that's what makes all this so important. Because we're talking about real people's lives here. It's not just some theoretical debate. And that's why this directive, it doesn't just set down rules, it actually tries to make sure those rules are being followed.
Yeah.
That they actually mean something.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Enforcement. What happens if a company just kind of shrugs and says, we're not going to follow any of this directive stuff? Do they get away with it?
Not if the EU has anything to say about it. No way. This directive's very clear about that. Countries, they have to actually put penalties in place for companies that break the rules.
And we're not talking like a gentle warning here,
Oh,
right?
that is tough.
It's got to have some teeth.
Exactly. It's got to be something that makes them think twice. Because otherwise, what's the point, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about having penalties on the books. It's about making sure that workers can actually, use them. The directive makes it clear that there have to be procedures in place. Could be through the courts, could be some other way, but there has to be a system that works so workers and anyone representing them can take action if their rights are being violated.
Makes sense. It's like that old saying, right? Justice delayed is justice denied. If you have to jump through hoops and wait forever to get your rights recognized, it doesn't really help anyone.
Exactly. And you know what else is interesting? Remember we were talking about how countries, if they want to restrict agency work, they need a good reason. Well, the directive also makes them report back to the European Commission about what they find, what they learn through that process.
Oh, so it's like a checkup, making sure they're doing their homework.
Pretty much. It's about transparency and accountability. They can't just make a decision in a vacuum. They have to explain their reasoning, back it up with evidence.
Wow, they really did think of everything with this directive, didn't they?
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in, but it's pretty impressive.
It really is. And it shows you just how complex this whole issue is. It's not simple.
So we've talked about the past. We've talked about how things look right now. Any thoughts on where all this is headed in the future?
Ooh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because the world of work, it's not exactly slowing down, is it? Think about the gig economy, for example. All those platforms connecting freelancers with work, people driving for ride-sharing apps, that stuff basically didn't exist back when this directive was put in place.
That's true. It's a whole new world.
Right, and that's what makes this so fascinating. We have this directive, which was incredibly forward-thinking for its time. But now the question becomes, how do we take these rules, these protections for workers that we've been talking about, and how do we make them work in this new landscape?
How do we make sure everyone benefits from these changes, not just a select few?
Exactly. And those are really important questions, questions that, frankly, we don't have all the answers to. Not yet, anyway. But the good news is it's something people are thinking about, talking about, and that's how we move forward by having those conversations.
That's a great point to end on. So for everyone listening, we've really gone deep on this one. Directive 2008-104-EC, we've explored it, dissected it, and hopefully helped you understand it a little better.
And even more importantly, if any of this sparked your curiosity, if you're thinking about your own work situation or you just find this stuff interesting, don't stop here. Keep learning. Keep asking questions. It's your life, your work, your rights.
Well said. Knowledge is power. We say it all the time, and it's true.
Couldn't agree more. Until next time, everybody.